later on recordings.
Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashtarothi, and let's talk about gambling. Okay, so before I even begin, I guess I'm going to need a series of disclaimers. I have never really participated in gambling in Eve. I think that the closest thing that I've ever gotten is I'm pretty sure I bought like maybe a couple of lottery tickets back in the day with a Alliance Lotto. I know I've played a little bit of Summer Blink back in the day. I'm pretty sure that was with free money though, like a promotion. And I'm friends with the guy who made Eve Blackjack, and we did some promo codes with him, and I got some free ISK that way, not that much, and I did some blackjack with it. Other than that, I can't think of anything that I've done when it comes to actual gambling in Eve other than using ECM. As far as getting money from gambling, I, of course, write for the Crossing Zebras, or Crossing Zebras, and they get most of their ISK thanks to EveBet, which is no longer going to be a thing as of the 8th, which we will get to in just a few moments. But I do get ISK from them. It's worth noting that EveBet has not been implicated in any sort of RMT. They did not get banned. They did not get their assets seized. So as far as anyone's concerned, EveBet is in the clear, which means all of the ISK that's flown into Crossing Zebras, or flowed into Crossing Zebras, is hopefully also in the clear. But I guess at this point we're just going to have to see. Anywho, let's get started. Earlier today, CCP announced that third-party gambling in Eve is going to be now against the terms of service, starting with the release of Ascension on the 8th. This marks the second biggest shakeup to happen to Eve in recent memory, the first of which being, of course, alpha clone changes, which is also happening on the 8th. So the 8th is now going to be a very huge change for the way that we operate Eve. And we're now going to start seeing those changes start to affect us now. So first of all, let's talk about why that's a huge deal. Let's talk about the history of gambling in Eve. First of all, gambling in Eve has been around longer than I have. One of the original, like the progenitors, were in Corp or in Alliance lotteries. Nullsec does this a lot, where somebody will hold a raffle and raise a bunch of money and give away some cool ships, and that's a method to help an organization raise money, or even a person raise money from other people while providing some enjoyment. Now, this is why raffles are done anywhere, right? This is why lotteries are done anywhere. But that's kind of where it began. Eventually, various websites kind of formalized that process, and the biggest one was known as Somer Blink. And Somer Blink allowed you to do these lotteries on a very micro scale. They lasted like 15 minutes, or until everyone bought a ticket, and then boom, a winner is decided and you can move on. So people, these early gambling sites, especially Somer Blink, were fantastically successful and made just boat tons of money, or ISK rather. However, obviously the issue of RMT has always kind of hung as a shadow over these institutions. RMT is, of course, real money trading, the idea that with these large sums of ISK, they have to do something with it, and they can use it to sell on the black market to make some real-life cash off of it. This is, of course, as always has been, against Eve's terms of service. The next biggest thing was Somer Blink rose so high into power, they started becoming a big-name thing, especially with Eve Vegas and other events, and it was so big that at some point CCP a few years ago provided several rare, actually pretty much at that time unique ships. These well, actually no, it was the Golden Magnates. They were going to give out the Golden Magnates, and the community lost their crap because those were for the Amar Championship from years and years ago. This is, of course, before the most recent Amar Championship. And eventually CCP backed down and gave them some very special versions of the Stratios and the Astero, called the Sanctuary, I think, ones, which incidentally are basically identical to the Sanctuary skins that we now have. But at that time, they were rare. They're unique. They're the only ways to get it. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that it still remains as the only way to have gotten those ships was to win them from the Somer Blink during Eve Vegas like 3-4 years ago. So this was a huge deal, and then on top of that, it was discovered that CCP had been giving out these Ishikone Watch Scorpions to various different agencies for like doing good stuff for the community, but they gave some to Summer Blink, and that was seen, as well as everything else, to kind of be this huge betrayal of trust. And you know, there's this big kind of movement in the Eve consciousness to make sure that CCP does not show favoritism, and that strongly showed favoritism for Sober Blink versus any other gambling site. At any rate, long story short, shortly thereafter, Summer Blink is implicated in RMT and eventually is shut down and banned. This was a big fiasco. A lot of people kind of had problems with it. It was discussed a lot, but a lot of people kind of saw it as the good guys winning, as it were, because of all of the previous history with Summer. Then, because Summer died, a lot of other gambling websites were able to kind of gain a foothold. Now, there were already several other established websites, including IWantISK and EveBet, but with Summer being gone, it allowed those groups to kind of seize more of the market share of the gambling track, as it were. Then, something changed. Last year, early this year, IWantISK effectively declared war on Space Monkey's Alliance for stealing money. And this is what kicked off what we now know as either World War B or the Casino War. And the reason why it's called the Casino War was because IWantISK and their higher-end bankers purchased or hired effectively all of the Imperium's enemies as mercenaries in order to strike at the Imperium with a unified force. And they were quite successful. But this represented kind of a huge moral dilemma. We knew as a community that these gambling websites had effectively infinite ISK, but up until this point, they hadn't really done anything besides community support projects or, you know, funding things like crossing zebras or other, you know, kind of good feel-good stuff. The fact that they went to war means that they made an enemy. And they also influenced the political landscape on a level that most people are just unable to do. In fact, most Imperium members made the complaint that effectively the only counter to this is to just build a better gambling site, because you really they prey on the human nature of gambling and all that kind of stuff and addiction. And so it isn't like you can just counter it by convincing people to not do it, because people are just going to do it. It's just the nature of the beast. And so a lot of people expounded that this was kind of unfair. Now, it's also worth noting that after World War B was finished, several of the main people, including Lenny, has gone on to kind of do more bullying, blowing up Fortizars and HiSec and trying to kind of create a new establishment and, you know, whatnot. But it's also true that these same entities have been doing a lot of good for the communities. They have funded a lot of community events, EveNT, a lot of streamers. I know Iron Bank was very well known for just dropping into new streamers' accounts that were just checking out the game and basically just handing them a couple of plex to get them started, and made a lot of, you know, did a lot of good that way. But they also started funding these citadels and other large-scale projects. Many of the keep stars that have gone up with a lot of ISK being provided by these high-powered bankers and gambling owners. So that's like kind of the good stuff that they're doing. But let's talk about the problem with RMT. RMT is a huge issue in EVE Online. In fact, one could potentially argue that RMT is the single most important issue in EVE. Now, the nice thing is that it hasn't been that big of a problem. Like, it hasn't been that widespread, or at least not damagingly widespread in recent years, which is why you don't necessarily hear about it as much as some other problems. But it does have the impact. Basically, RMT, if it was allowed to run away with itself, would effectively kill EVE completely, because EVE is based on its real economy, and RMT kind of circumvents that process. Now, CCP has created Plex, and one of the biggest functions of Plex is actually to help combat RMT. So now if you need to pay money for ISK, you can do so by selling a service of account time to other players. But that is a market-driven, controlled need kind of effect within the game, which helps the game in and of itself and has a limiter, right? Like there's only going to be so many people willing to part so much ISK to be able to continue to play the game. Plex has gone a long way in making sure that RMT is not a problem. But for these larger entities, for the causers of RMT, and that's from a consumer level. From a purchasing level, from the seller's level, you still have this problem. You still have high-powered entities that we know or that we suspect are doing RMT, and the more they're allowed to ply their trade, the more people will be tempted to purchase illegal ISK because the price will go down or whatever. And so it's very important to suppress RMT at all costs, practically. Okay, so that being said, let's talk about the timing of this choice. This occurred on October 12th, which is less than 1 month from the Ascension expansion. Now, that's a good time to do it because Ascension is kind of going to be a reset for EVE. We're going to get potentially a lot of new players, and these new players are not going to even know about the old EVE except for in stories. So because you have this big point in time in which basically all measurements are going to be based on before and after this moment, right? Like there's going to be the universe of EVE prior to Ascension and the universe of EVE after Ascension. And so now's a really good time to make these big hardcore changes. Additionally, they already had to go over the TOS and the EULA in order to change a ton of stuff to make it so that alpha clones are allowed. Because according to the current TOS, you can't alpha clone. You have to pay for an account in order to be able to play past your past your free trial. So they already had to redo the TOS, which means they already had to engage their lawyers, and their lawyers already had to have a project. And so you can put, in addition to that, if they knew that they wanted to deal with this casino stuff from months ago, they would just be like, you know what, we already know that there's bigger changes coming to the TOS. We're just going to lump them all in together. So that's the first reason why this could be happening right now. The other reason why is a bit more interesting, which is that this has occurred after the World War B, or the Casino War, has completely wrapped up, effectively. So the ISK being used to fund that war is no longer necessary. That ISK is now going to other things, in particular the Keepstar projects and the Fortizar killing and all that kind of stuff. So, like CCP, if they didn't want to disrupt the war, and I know a lot of people are going to say, like, oh, it's in support of this or whatever, but in a lot of ways, if they had performed this action during the war, they would have aborted the war, and that not only would have been just like, oh yeah, good for the Imperium and bad for everybody else, but like it would have been a very conflicting message. CCP was doing a lot to try to stay out of, they like to let these kind of things play out, and since the balls were already running, it would be incredibly disruptive to just kind of rip the curtain out, or rip the carpet out. And now that it's all over, now you can be like, okay, we're done now. You had your fun. We're good. So that's kind of the possibilities behind like what this ban happening now might mean. So let's look at the timeline, because IWantISK was actually banned originally like on January 1st, early this year. So in the early of this year, right as the war was starting to kind of build up, IWantISK, several of their key people were banned, and then they were unbanned and found to be, in the clear from RMT. And folks like Eep and Lenny even went on to podcasts and used this as evidence that they weren't, in fact, RMTing or anything like that. Of course, now a lot of those same people have now been completely banned forever and had all of their assets seized this morning because they were, in fact, doing RMT. Which leads us to the question of, when did the IWantISK guys start doing RMT? They either started a long time ago, before the war, before their initial banning, or they started recently. If they started before the initial banning, then that means that either CCP detected it and let it go, or they failed to detect it and or failed to create sufficient evidence, and so they ended up unbanning them. It's worth noting that during FanFest, the security guys appear to be unhappy with the result of this, but it is unclear of whether or not they got completely overridden. In other words, they knew that something was going on, but then they were told that they weren't able to do it, or if they maybe weren't able to get quite enough evidence to really pin it down and make it drive home. You know, both of those could provide frustration. So it's kind of difficult to interpret that. But if IWantISK had always been doing RMT, then I guess my question is, what the hell are you doing making a giant show of yourself, right? Like, if your goal is to make money on your ISK empire, what the hell are you doing flaunting it around and making a big show of it and giving yourself enemies? Like, one of the biggest defenses that I had for IWantISK was, you know, if they were doing RMT, then they wouldn't be doing what they were doing. But if they had started doing RMT more recently, then that brings even more questions. Like, maybe they thought that they were in the clear because they got cleared the first time, and so they got cocky. But like, if they started doing RMT more recently, that's just silly, right? You know that this is a big deal, and you started. So I don't know. I think that it might be more likely that they were doing it before, maybe not as much. Maybe they did get cocky a little bit. But let's talk about, like, the CCP, as I said, would allow this war to happen even if they detected it for a couple of reasons. One, it's content, right? Like, a war is a war. And if that ISK is going to good use, right? Like, ISK that's going to war contracts isn't being RMT'd, right? So let's get one thing straight. Nobody bought ISK to fund this war. IWantISK had X amount of ISK, a certain percentage of that went to funding a war, and a different percentage of that went to selling for money, right? So it's not like somebody RMT'd to fund a war. They had ISK, and they had two programs, a war and RMT. And so in a lot of ways, if you were to take the legitimate ISK away, you are denying content that is based on legitimate ISK. And so there is a fair argument to let the content happen, especially since this is advantageous to CCP, right? Like, in a universe in which you can either have a great war or not have a great war, it is advantageous to CCP to have a great war. Likewise, if more nefariously, it seems that with Phoebe changes, with all these other changes that they've made, they really wanted to break up the large-scale coalitions. This has been a big thing with the new nullsec. And the Imperium existed as one of the last unsaleable large coalitions. And so it's possible that since this war was basically going to the higher goals of CCP as a company, like trying as the custodian. I know this sounds so bad, but who knows, you know? Like, they could have decided that the Imperium needed to fall as being part of their ideas for the future, and without this, the Imperium were nearly unsaleable. And so, you know, it's very possible that they basically looked the other way as the devil did his work, and now that it is over, they are punishing the specific wrongdoers for the part of their arrangement that was wrong. Again, the war was not funded illegally, but the people who funded the war were also doing other illegal activities, and that is an incredibly important distinction to make. So then, if CCP failed to detect it the first time and have now only now just detected it, it could be possible that they got not sufficient evidence, and so let them continue to do what they were doing and continue to think that they were safe, all the while collecting the evidence that they did need to do it when they knew it was going to matter, which was right before Ascension, right before they were going to do the TOS changes for these new alpha clones. Yeah, so I think that that's kind of the breakdown of the possibilities. I know that there's no solid answer because we still don't know a lot, and we probably will never know all of the details about how this all went down. What we do know is that gambling is now not going to be allowed in EVE. There's still some questions about whether or not, like, alliance level or community, like lotteries or something like that can be done. We're still waiting on some answers from that. And, whatever. There are some other interesting ramifications besides this. First of all, Iron Bank, who's one of the guys who was banned, he was the only character who had, to my knowledge, that has every single skill points. The day after skill injectors were released, he bought enough skill injectors to take a character from brand new to maxed out skill points. And that character, as far as I know, is now banned. So the only 100% skilled up character in the game, as far as I know, is now banned. Crossing Zebras, who I write for, has made an announcement saying that they do plan on continuing to operate, and they have some contingency plans for that. I think a lot of streamers are still going to be willing to work. I think that this is going to be a big issue as the community kind of tries to figure out other ways to finance efforts, but I don't think it's going to be the end of the universe, right? We are a creative lot, and I think that we are more than capable of dealing with these kinds of changes. So I guess the big questions is the two big questions that I have are, one, if you're going to RMT, why make such a big show of yourself? Did IWantISK become cocky, greedy, or both? And the second question, actually, I don't have a second question. So I guess that's my big question. What do you guys think? Do you think that IWantISK got cocky, greedy, thrown under the bus, or what? Let me know in the comments below. Let me know what you think. There's one other thing that I want to point out, just as a side note. EveBet has been really demonized in all this because they're one of the other groups that needed to be shut down. But it's really important to note that EveBet did not actually get implicated in this. They're exonerated as far as anybody knows. So I know a lot of people have been giving certain websites crap, and the Imperium have been smugging it up about all of this. Which, I mean, whatever. You took on the casinos and you won, so I guess good for you. But I think that we are saying that, okay, well, these guys got implicated, and therefore everyone involved is bad, and that's just simply not true, right? Like, EveBet didn't seem to have any problems. Crossing Zebras doesn't seem to have any problems. So let's focus on the people who did wrong things and kind of how we are going to build community events such as EVNT, various tournaments, charities, whatnot. How are we going to keep those going without these massive piles of ISK to throw at them? I think it's still possible. We're just going to have to get more creative. So if you guys have any thoughts, opinions, ideas, please link them, or please talk about them in the comments below. And I will see you in space. And I'll see you in space.